Hi everyone, and welcome to our second flip collab for our unit. This one is the A2 flip collab for our policy development project, which is due on Friday the 2nd of October 2020. I can't believe we're saying October already. You wonder where this year's gone. Now, the way this flip collab is going to work is we're going to talk about Rachel's top 5 things that you need to know to get you started. So I can't possibly talk about everything today. I've tried to word it and sort of give you information on things that I thought were most valuable to know straight up about each of the steps that you need to take to complete this project. When we have the interactive collab, we'll go into more detail about what specific policies we're going to be focusing on in terms of the scenario, and sort of brainstorm some more of the legislation and regulations and things. So this is an overview of each of the steps and things, again, that I thought were important to help you get started. Now, you guys can read through the assessment details for yourself, but it lets you know that you are required to work in a team of 2 to 3 people to develop a specific policy for the early childhood workplace. You're going to look at policy development and the review process, and put that together in a policy regarding step 1. So this is Rachel's top 5 things to get started. So number 1 that I've chosen is that you need to understand the scenario and understand that there is a scenario. So you've actually been given an area of policy to focus on. So we can't have a different sort of policy looked at. So we couldn't have something, say, about, safety in the centre. This particular scenario focuses on digital professionalism and communication. So you need to make sure that as a team you have a good understanding of this scenario. So it just states that in a recent policy review undertaken in preparation for a compliance check in your education setting, has been noted that you do not have an up-to-date digital professionalism communication policy. One of the teachers also regularly talks about the workplace on social media, and the director has concerns about confidentiality and any legal breaches that may be occurring. So your team has been given the task of writing a specific policy to guide the conduct in a way that meets professional, ethical, legislative and regulatory standards. So today I'm not going to really focus so much on the digital professionalism and communication policy side of things, because like I said, my plan is in the interactive collab to look at examples of digital professionalism policies and sort of talk more about what could be included and what's relevant to that particular area of policy. In terms of getting you started today, it's probably more important to really talk about what's involved in each of the steps and then connect it back to the idea of digital professionalism when we get to the interactive collab itself. So step 1 is just knowing, or point 1 is just knowing that there is a scenario. You do need to link to digital professionalism and communication. There is issues to do with social media that you'll need to take on board, and that you're going to be getting together as a group to write this policy. Obviously, there would be a policy in place, but it needs to be updated to reflect these sort of new concerns and new issues. Point number 2 is to understand policy for step 1. So this is the team task. So if you open up your assessment details, you'll see that step 1 says team research approximately 600 words, where we are going to research and identify the ethical, the legislative and regulatory requirements that inform the content and practice of the policy topic. You're going to summarise your findings, explaining how your policy will be influenced by these requirements. So in our assessment details, we're connecting to week 6, week 7 and week 8. So as we're progressing over these next couple of weeks, this will all be put together to help you write this team part of step 1. So I have had a look myself at a few examples so that I would be the most help to you. And from what I can see from all of these great examples that I've got in front of me is that most of them sort of did a bit of an introduction into, I guess, good elements of good leadership. But the main focus was on what was the purpose of the policy. So they gave examples of why it was important to have policies in place and why it was important to have policies that support, ethical and legislative and regulatory requirements. So in our interactive collab, we will brainstorm in a little bit more detail about the difference between the ethical and the legislation and the regulatory. So legislation is probably a little bit more straightforward, because when we think of legislation, we think of laws and acts to do with, particular policies. So, for example, we might have things like privacy acts or Early Childhood Australia Code of Ethics, social media guidelines, child protection acts. So all of those sorts of things are going to come together to talk about what's important with leadership and how they are there to support the well-being and health and safety of everyone who's involved in the centre. As a part of this, as well as talking about our policy topic, we're going to be highlighting a few key elements so we've talked about good leadership and what they do. We're going to talk about the purpose of the policy. We're going to talk about how we can inform and guide stakeholders, how there is appropriate ethical use of social media to protect children, how we're being proactive in being safe with children, and how it also links to things like National Quality Framework and those different quality standards, as well as things potentially like Early Years Framework. But once we've outlined why policy is important and where it sort of comes from, we need to make a bit of a list. And I notice that most of the examples I have in front of me have just popped them in dot points about what kinds of policies would be in play if we're talking about digital professionalism and communication. Because not every single form of legislation or not every single form of regulatory requirement is going to relate to digital professionalism. So we have to highlight which examples of legislation we think connect well to the idea of digital professionalism. So things like we want our policy in terms of digital professionalism and communication policy, we want the policy to be able to comply with the relevant laws, legislation and regulations. We want the policy to align with the philosophy of the centre and, align with the vision and the goals of the centre, because if we're writing policies and they need to be implemented, they have to fit in with, the overall culture of the centre and be able to be implemented. We want our policy to reflect community values so that it aligns again with the culture of the centre. We want our policies to be focused and specific so that everyone can be on the same page, I guess, and there wouldn't be any grey area about what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. We'd want the policy to highlight and examine potential risks, particularly with that idea of social media that they talk about in the scenario and how there could be potential risks with that. We want to be able to promote consistency of practice so that everyone, again, is on the same page. We want the policy to clearly outline who the stakeholders are and it's clearly understandable to the stakeholders, and there's a precise execution of guidelines. Again, to be clear, we want the policy to perhaps have timelines so that it can be continually reviewed, and we want, I guess, a policy that's involved conferencing and collaboration with all sorts of stakeholders and people within the centre. So part one has highlighted what good leaders do, what good policy is all about, what are some of the acts and legislations that might be relevant to our particular topic, and what do we really want from our policy, which were some of the things that I've just highlighted for you there. Okay, so step 2 is also part of your team task. So it's again something that you are going to be working on together. Now, this outline here has come straight from our assessment details. So it's got articulate your vision, identify your stakeholders, gather information, what data will inform you, action plan and plan for collaboration. Now I've got my tip over here. What I've noticed from all the samples that I've looked at so far is that most people set this out. They didn't put their goal in the table. They had their goal as a separate paragraph above, but all of the rest of this information was in a table. They had identified the stakeholders on the side and then their information next to it. Just a tip, whether it's up to your group whether you'd like to do it like that, but if that helps you to organise your thinking or perhaps even divvying up ideas or sharing ideas, it might help you just to outline it in a table if you would like. Okay, so let's talk about these step by step just to get you started. Again, we'll talk about it in more detail in relation to digital professionalism at the interactive collab. So articulate your vision. What are you hoping to achieve? You have this new policy. We want to have it in place, but what's it there for? What are you trying to achieve? Why does this policy need updating? What's it there for? What's its purpose? Think about what you're using it for. So you might say something like, this centre, we acknowledge that social media, is great because it's got immediateness and accessibility, and lots of digital tools are great for communication, and you can inform staff, and things like Seesaw and Story Park are great for communicating with parents and sharing learning and connecting to the wider community. So you can maybe highlight some of the things that digital formats are great for, but then on the probably other side of that, we have to acknowledge that there are risks and that there is, ethical situations that we might come across in terms of using this in a safe manner for all children and staff. So you might say things like, for staff, students and parents, you want to act in a way, firstly, that the centre is reflected in a positive light, and you want all staff and students to be on board in using social media in a respectful manner, perhaps. You want it to be used successfully across all stakeholders. So it's just a bit of a vision to outline what you're hoping to achieve by having this policy in place. And at the end of the day, it's all about child safety and keeping kids safe in a digital environment, and making sure that not only the kids are safe, but staff feel supported, parents feel confident that their children are not being photographed or not being on social media without their permission. So that's why this policy is in place. So what are you hoping to achieve? We then need to be able to identify your stakeholders. So who will be involved and how can you integrate ethical considerations? So who will be involved? Let me have a look through my examples. We've got things like, so try and think really broadly about who your stakeholders are. So obviously it's going to be even the children. So the enrolled children, the children are competent and capable to contribute to decisions in the learning community they are part of. We've got parents and carers. So we want the perspective of parents to carers to be valued and considerations of their concern and the safety of their children. The staff are very important, obviously, because they're contributing to the policy making and the developing trust and respect between employees. And obviously, they're the ones who have to implement the policy in order to keep kids safe. There might be community partners, agency staff, external parties, list goes on, committee members. It's wonderful that this is a group task because you can sit there and think together and do a bit of a brainstorm about who you think all the stakeholders are and whether you have covered them all and probably even thought a little bit about some of the ethical considerations there. An example of an ethical consideration might be something like managers and leaders should avoid activities or behaviours that might alienate a group or that their concern is not being addressed or heard. They should attempt to achieve a fair distribution of strength and weaknesses of the communication systems and just take into account respective risks and vulnerabilities. So that would be a consideration that you could put onto leaders and managers in that sense. So how are you going to gather information? What processes will you use and what documents will you provide? So this is going to be about gathering information because, like we said, if we're identifying a whole lot of stakeholders, it means that stakeholder opinion needs to come into the policy so that everyone feels involved and everyone feels consulted. So who are you going to be consulting? Who are you going to be gathering information from and how are you going to do it? So gathering information could be things like conducting a survey, say for example with your families or staff or external stakeholders. Perhaps you could give them the old copy of the digital professionalism and communication policy and see if they've got any ideas for any updates. They could tell you what they like about it. They could suggest improvements in the survey. You could perhaps hold open discussion forums to get some face-to-face feedback. You could collate data from the current systems showing how digital communication is being employed, highlight any issues, problems or breaches. You want to seek, obviously, gathering information from staff is going to be really important because, as we mentioned before, they're the ones who are using the policy and they will, I'm sure, definitely see flaws or perhaps know of times when things have failed in the past or things can be improved on the current policy. And you probably even want to go even wider and maybe just, if we're looking at things like, legislation and we're looking at regulation, so maybe gathering information in terms of gathering a whole lot of, say things about child privacy law and seeing if the current digital professionalism policy links well with that. So maybe, gathering some research could also be really good. Whether you want to consult with the kids, I think that's a really cute idea that you consult with the enrolled children, perhaps asking them about how they feel about their photo being taken and how they feel about, would they give their own consent to that happening? Which links to the Human Rights Commission and Early Childhood Australia. Okay, so once you've gathered the information, what data will inform you? What will be important to know? How will you identify the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats? Now, from what I can see, most people did do that SWOT analysis. And I think it was just very easy to sort of set it out in a kind of SWOT analysis way. Let me just see if this person did. Sorry guys, I'm just busy flicking through. Yes, they did. Okay, so let's have a look at two different examples of a SWOT analysis. So things to consider could perhaps be things like, what could be important to know, things that you'd need to consider, perhaps the diversity of the stakeholders. There could be cultural diversity of the stakeholders. You might even have to take into consideration the staff qualifications. Perhaps you have to take into consideration staff skills, or perhaps even more relevant could be staff turnover, because if we're having a high staff turnover, they might not have the same insight into what's happening at that particular place or particular centre. All right, so strengths could be things like positive data from surveys, forums could be done. It's currently being done well. Staff with proficient communication skills, things like strengthening the partnership between all the stakeholders. That could be something that's going to be really positive. So what you need to look at in the strengths column is what are the good things that are going to happen once this policy is in place. What are going to be the benefits of having this policy in place, like enhancing student learning or a stronger connection to the national standards and the quality standards. It could be things like there's more consistency amongst staff and understanding and consistent implementation of the policy because everyone's, on the same page. Potential weaknesses. I guess determining what needs to be improved could be a potential weakness. Accessing how digital platforms are used by stakeholders to ensure that the centre is not being discredited. Stakeholders' accessibility to social media. I think also a potential weakness could be stakeholders are interesting because they are going to be the parents, they are going to be perhaps committee members, community members, sometimes people who don't always have such a great insight. I can talk for myself as a parent. Parents might know what they want for their individual child, but do they know what's best in a policy? Do they know what's good for the good of the centre? If I don't know early childhood learning and I don't know how policy is implemented in that kind of way, who am I really to give, or not so much who am I to give feedback, but you can understand where, my feedback could be a potential weakness or should be considered in that way. So what are some opportunities which could be really positive that comes out of this new policy? There could be things like it promotes the centre in terms of philosophy and curriculum programs. It could help celebrate diversity and promote inclusion. It helps to engage with parents much better because you're inviting them into the communication project and the process and consultation process. It's obviously helping with digital technologies in terms of enhancing learning, and perhaps it will also provide an opportunity to use digital technology better because staff can feel confident that there's great policy in place, everyone's on the same page, we know we are allowed to do this. We don't want staff umming and ahhing, oh, can I take that photo? Oh, I'm not sure, don't know what to do, so I just won't do it. We want staff to be on board with digital technologies and we want them using them and we want them to feel confident and protected so that they don't feel unsure. The threats could be things like breaches to the privacy, so making sure that that's really tight. Staying informed of current regulations is also a threat because, things are always changing and, we need to make sure that these policies are all just always updated. Perhaps another potential threat could be this, as we were mentioning just before, things like socio-economic conditions of stakeholders will need to be considered in terms of making the policy effective. There could even potentially be a breakdown in the relationship between parents and staff and public, and, a mediation or conflicts might need to happen, especially if people don't agree about what's going to go in this particular policy. Your action plan comes next, and I'm not sure, some people have put it in a separate little table, Some have just continued with the same table. But basically what your action plan is outlining, we can talk a little bit more about format in our interactive collab as well. What this action plan is outlining is, who's going to be responsible for what tasks and when will each task be completed. So you might have things like collecting data by consulting stakeholders about digital communication practices, for example. Who's going to be responsible for that? Well, it's going to be the leader, the manager, or the educators, and the time frame for that could be 2 weeks. You could also compile data and discuss findings. The manager could be the responsible person, and you might want 2 weeks to complete that. So your little headings for this table, if you want to keep it a separate table, is going to be the tasks. So who's doing what, the responsible person, and the time frame. Or on this other example, we've got task, responsible, and time elapsed. I really like in this other little example that I've got, just to give you a heads up, that they've sort of classified each of the little sections, which I thought was a good idea because it might help just organise your thinking a little bit. They've called one data collection, and they're going to do a child consultation, parent surveys, and distribute discussion forums, and then they gave themselves a time limit. And then they said, so that was data collection was first, then collate the data, then do research, then write a draft policy, then review, and then finalise and implement. So they gave themselves little headings to help sort of, first we're collecting the data, then we're going to analyse the data, then we're going to review, then we're going to write the policy, then we're going to ask these, So they had little headings along the way to sort of keep them organised. Your plan for collaboration, just to flick over my many pages in my hand, is part of that action plan. So who will meet, oh dear, skipped ahead. Who will meet, how often, what will be undertaken in each collaboration session. So if you're covering that table that I just suggested, you've covered the action plan and plan for collaboration altogether, which kind of makes sense because we've put it together in that table. For your number 4 is writing the policy, which is step 3, which is on your own. Not too scary because it's only a further 600 words. So let me just get that open for you. Now again, what I love about this assignment is that the assessment details are so clear and they tell you exactly what you need to include and where and what. So it's just been really well worded like that, really very, very clear. I say, if you follow these headings that I have for you here, I've taken them directly from the assessment details. They help you to understand what to do. So follow each one exactly, have little subheadings and write what you need to here. So you've got your policy statement. This should be a strong statement about what the policy is there for and what it is set to achieve. So something like, this digital professionalism and communication policy sets out to achieve and convey our centre's approach to social media when communicating with stakeholders. This policy offers stakeholders the parameters for the professional and personal use of social media platforms and digital communications mediums. So it's a strong statement related to why this policy is important and what it's there for. What it's doing ultimately is to protect the children and bring everyone a consistent approach to digital professionalism. Your rationale, so your policy statement is just like that one I just read out to you then, short, sharp. It's probably 50 words, perhaps less. It's just a very short, sharp statement to get you started. Your rationale is where you go into more detail about why the policy is needed. Why is it important? And we want you to use academic research here. So you should be backing up why this policy is needed. And you can connect to all sorts of research to do with digital professionalism, but the advantages of using technology but keeping kids safe at the same time is so vitally important. So we need that because, technology is everywhere. It's, prominent in our lives. It makes things convenient, real-time communication with parents. But we need to keep kids safe, and we need to keep staff safe, because we want to, like in my little, my little example before about, an educator picks up the camera, wants to take a photo, but ums and ahs about whether that's allowed or, what exactly the rules are. We want to keep staff safe so that they are not put at risk of any sort of issues there. So your rationale is a statement linking to theory that tells you about why the policy is needed, why it's important. Your procedure must be at least 10 steps. It could be more. It's going to be steps or specific guidelines that your policy follows. So imagine this is the rules. Someone is working in the centre or working in your kinder, and they pick up this, and they should be able to see these 10 steps. They're the rules that the staff will follow, and remember to connect to community stakeholders, use evidence and research for support. So things like, looking through my pages. So number 1, online behaviour should at all times demonstrate respect for the early learning centre and community. That is number 1. At all times, digital professionalism is expected from staff, including acting in an ethical manner, using social media, even for personal communication, as those communications can reflect on the operation of the centre and the employee's role. So you can see that in those 2 examples, they're explaining what is expected of staff and pretty much anyone that comes into contact with the workplace is able to pick up these 10 steps and understand from the 10 steps what it is that they are allowed to do and not to do. They can follow it clearly. It says all online communication should be via the centre's digital platform. That's something I can pick up as a staff member and understand. Employees are required to maintain professional boundaries and should not add or accept current family members or children as friends to any personal social media platforms. I can, as an employee, pick that up as a step and say, yes, I understand that I'm not to friend community members, children and parents as a part of my own personal social media. So you can understand from those couple of examples that these are the steps that we want people to follow. This is the policy. What do you want people to know? And like we said, we don't want there to be ambiguity. We don't want staff to be worried. Imagine this was a real policy in a real centre. We want clear, concise steps that explain what staff members are expected to do and know and not do. Your next little part says scope. Who does the policy apply to? So please outline in a little paragraph. This one will be quite short, I would imagine, that who this policy applies to. Does it apply to staff? Does it apply to parents, contractors, volunteers, the children, or pretty much everybody that comes into contact with the centre itself? Your legislation and regulatory constructs, so which acts and laws apply to this policy, list them in dot points. So it could be like Privacy Act, United Nations Conventions of Rights of the Child, Early Childhood's Code of Ethics, the Child Protection Act of 1999, State of Queensland, Teacher Professional Standards, ATSL standards. So along a list of what legislation, a list of any regulatory constructs. Whether you want to do your own state, it's completely up to you. But as long as you relate what legislation and laws apply to the particular policy we're talking about. Now, you need to provide a list of sources, because in order to write your policy, you would have connected to things like, Australian Children's Education and Quality Area Authority, government websites. You've drawn on all of the research in order to complete this. So you need to show what list of sources have been used to compile this policy. Now, this is not your reference list for Swinburne. This is just the references that connect to this particular policy. So if you used the Department of Education and Training for Victoria, if you use the Victorian VIT website and it connects to your policy, it needs to go in your sources list. And then at the end of your report is your normal bibliography and reference list that you would have for an assignment anyway. So there's two different separate lists. These are just the sources that connect to the specific policy. Your very last thing is an authorization and review, because we know that policy is forever changing and always needing to be kept up to date, and it does need to be reviewed by particular stakeholders. So who needs to authorize this policy and how will it be reviewed and when? So you might add things like, this policy is currently in draft form and will require consultation before its full implementation. You'll obviously need to connect with the national quality standard areas, and it will be ongoing. If you want to give timelines, it's quite fine, or if you want to just say it's an ongoing process of review, then that's quite okay too. Really quickly, just remember that you need to be a responsible team member, and it's really frustrating for those people who try to contact others with no response. So please, be positive and be proactive, and please keep your team up to date. Even if you're struggling a little bit and you might need more time with something, just let people know. It's really frustrating when people just don't get back to you. You'd be much better off just to let them know that you just need a bit more time, or you haven't had a chance to read the thing they sent you yet. I'm sure everybody understands. If you need extensions, or if you need to talk about what's happening in your team, just please let Bree and I know, and we can have a chat to you about it. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope this helps. We'll see you in the interactive collab, and we'll go into a bit more detail. Thanks.